Story 1, Room 103. City School Number 17 looked completely ordinary. None of the students or teachers suspected the secrets its old building held. At the center of all the whispers and rumors was Room 103. No one talked about it openly, but everyone knew one thing: you shouldn't go inside. The room had been locked for over 20 years. According to legend, a literature teacher named Galina Sergeevna once taught there. She was strict but fair, and her students consistently achieved top marks on exams. No one could explain what happened to her. One day, she was found dead at her desk. Her face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, and in her hand, she tightly gripped a piece of chalk. The official cause of death was a heart attack. But rumors swirled that, in the days leading up to her death, she had often stayed late at school, writing something strange in her notebook. That notebook was never found. Since then, the room had been sealed. Yet sometimes sounds could be heard coming from behind the door: creaking floorboards, the rustle of pages being turned, and a faint, muffled female voice. Even the security guards refused to investigate. Andrei, a senior in the 11th grade, always laughed at these stories. One day during a break, he decided to prove to his friends that there was nothing mystical about the room. The dare was simple: enter Room 103. The door was padlocked, but Andrei quickly found an old nail and picked it. The door creaked loudly as it opened, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, everything looked as if time had stopped. Dust covered the desks, but on the teacher's desk, books were scattered as though someone had recently been flipping through them. On the blackboard, written in faded, bold handwriting, were lines from a poem. Where shadows roam in endless gloom, do not seek the path to light. No way exists, here in the tomb. Horror dwells, your answer's plight. Andrei felt a faint movement of air. He turned and saw the door slowly closing. "Who's there?" he asked, trying to sound brave. There was no answer, but a whisper came from the corner. In the darkness, he saw a shadow, but it didn't look human. It was too dense, like smoke gathering and starting to take shape. The shadow moved toward him. Andrei froze. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the blackboard began to tremble, and words appeared on it as if written by an invisible hand. "You should not have come." The shadow passed through him, leaving a chilling sensation in its wake. He ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. From the darkness, a voice, a woman's voice, eerily familiar, spoke. "You wanted the truth. Take it with you." A notebook appeared on the teacher's desk. Without thinking, Andrei grabbed it. At that moment, the door swung open. He bolted out of the room and collapsed, losing consciousness. When they found him, he couldn't explain anything. But his friends noticed he was clutching an old, worn notebook. No one knows what was written inside, because soon after, Andrei disappeared. A week later, Room 103 burned to the ground. Story 2, The Ghost of the Night Shift. School number 5 was built back in the 1950s. Over the years, its building aged, the walls cracked, but no repair crew could fix the main issue: the strange events that occurred at night. According to legend, a boy who once attended the school went missing. Despite an extensive search, he was never found. Years later, his name began appearing in chalk on blackboards in various classrooms. No one knew who was writing it. Sasha, a young security guard who had just started working there, heard about the rumors from his colleagues. He dismissed them as nonsense. On a Friday night, he was assigned to the late shift. Everything was quiet until midnight. Sasha patrolled the school, checked the locks, turned off the lights in the classrooms, and returned to his post. Around 1 a.m., he heard the sound of a door slamming. Probably the wind, he thought, and went to check. The hallway was silent, but one of the classroom doors was slightly ajar. It was the math room. Inside, an open notebook lay on a desk. Sasha stepped closer and saw that someone had scrawled words in pencil. "You can hear me, can't you?" A cold draft brushed past him. Shining his flashlight down the hallway, he heard footsteps. They echoed behind him, but when he turned, there was no one there. As he started walking back, the footsteps grew louder. Suddenly, the doors of all the classrooms began creaking open one by one. A faint whisper came from inside each room. Then, a child appeared in front of him, a boy, no older than 10, with a pale face. His eyes glowed faintly with a white light. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said. Sasha tried to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The boy's voice echoed again, this time from all directions. "They're already here." The boy vanished, and the school was plunged into complete darkness. From the shadows came a scraping sound, like dozens of hands crawling across the floor. Sasha ran toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. By morning, the cleaning staff found him sitting on the floor in the hallway. He was muttering something under his breath and didn't respond to their questions. Shortly after, he quit his job and left the city. It's said that on that night, someone wrote the missing boy's name on a classroom blackboard, and it can never be erased. Story 3, The Homework Assignment. Alya was the perfect student, but in her final year before graduation, she began feeling an unusual sense of unease. Her literature teacher assigned what seemed like an innocent task: write an essay about your greatest fear. Alya had always avoided thinking about her fears, she was afraid to acknowledge them even to herself. But she decided to come up with something neutral, so as not to stand out. The essay she wrote was about an ancient, abandoned forest where creatures roamed at night, their faces hidden in the darkness. Alya thought this would be a simple and even slightly eerie description for a school assignment. But when she brought the notebook to school, her teacher glanced at it and disappeared into the hallway with her work. Alya didn't think much of it. A few days later, she noticed that her teacher had become strange, her eyes were sunken, and there was an unsettling anxiety on her face. Then, on the day Alya went to get her notebook back, the teacher looked at her, and her lips barely moved. "Are you sure you wrote this essay yourself?" Alya laughed, thinking it was a joke, but her smile quickly faded when she saw her work. In the notebook, besides the story about the forest, were lines she didn't remember writing. "Soon you will be there. Beyond the line, where your fear will become a part of you. You will see them. You will be alone. And they will see you." The teacher remained silent, her eyes flashing with sparks of terror. That night, Alya couldn't sleep. Her room became so cold that her breath left a cloud in the air. She turned on the nightlight, and in that instant, in the reflection of the window, she saw a figure standing in the shadows, with eyes as empty as an abyss. Alya turned around, but there was no one there. Then her gaze fell on her notebook, left on the desk. On the first page, something was scratched out. "Don't turn around. They are already behind you." Alya jumped out of bed and quickly spun around to face the door. At that moment, a black hand reached out from under the table. Alya screamed and rushed toward the exit, but the door was locked. She heard laughter behind her, it was the same laughter she had heard in her notebook, filled with nothing but horror and darkness. By morning, Alya had disappeared. The notebook was found, and on the first page, it read, "You didn't understand. They took her. You're next." Story 4, The Hidden Passage Behind the Cabinet. School number 12 was a place that always gave students a sense of unease, especially when they walked past the old chemistry classroom. In this room stood an old, dusty wooden cabinet. No one knew what lay behind it, and so everything around it was shrouded in mystery. One day, a group of high school students, Ilya, Dima, and Ksyusha, decided to find out what was hidden behind the cabinet. They stared at it for a long time, thinking it was just an ordinary piece of furniture, but something about it caught their attention, as though the cabinet itself didn't want to be touched. No one could explain why, but that evening, when the group pushed against the cabinet, it seemed to give way on its own. Behind it was a small, nearly invisible door that led into a dark corridor. Once inside, they immediately felt the temperature drop, and the shadows around them grew thicker. The shadows on the walls appeared unnaturally long. Ksysha shivered when she felt invisible hands brush against her shoulder. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Something's wrong here." But Dima insisted they move forward. Old books lay scattered on the floor, their pages yellowed and torn. When Ilya picked one up, he saw a name on the cover he didn't recognize, Mikhail Artemov, class of 1982. But when he opened the first page, it read, "You found me. I've returned." The sound of footsteps grew louder. They heard someone, or something, following them. Ksysha quickly glanced back, and her face went pale. Along the wall, shadows seemed to chase after them, as if trying to overtake them. "Let's go back," she screamed, but when they turned around, the door was already shut. The shadows began to close in around them. They saw empty eyes gleaming in the dark, and at every moment, they felt an invisible force tightening around them. On the wall, a message appeared, etched by some unseen hand. "If you don't open it, you'll stay here forever." The group jumped to their feet and tried to run, but the corridor stretched on endlessly, and the door seemed farther away with each step. Finally, when they managed to escape, Dima suddenly vanished. A week later, they found him. But his body was covered in strange marks, and his eyes were as empty as the shadows they had seen. On his fingers, there were blood-stained carvings. "I'm not alone." Story 5, The Last Bell. At school number 3, graduates always heard terrifying stories about how no one should stay at school on the last bell. It was said that several years ago, a group of high school students decided to test these rumors. They went to a party in the assembly hall, and since then, no one had seen them. Masha, Nikita, and Valera laughed when they heard the story. On the day of the last bell, they decided to spend the night at school, thinking it was just an old scare. They approached the assembly hall, and though the doors were locked, they found a back entrance. The hall was dark, with only moonlight streaming through the broken windows. When they played music, it began to play an old melody, like a recording from the 1950s. The sound seemed to pierce the air, creating a heavy tension in the room. Suddenly, the lights in the hall began to dim, and figures appeared on the stage. They were students in old-fashioned school uniforms, but their eyes were hollow, like black voids, and their faces were expressionless. They stood still, as though waiting for something. One of them slowly stepped forward and said, "We've been waiting for you." At first, Masha, Nikita, and Valera thought it was just a prank, but then, right before their eyes, the figures began to move. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, as if they weren't using their legs, but were simply gliding through the air. Masha screamed and rushed to the door, but it was locked. The music kept playing, now with strange whispers in the background. Shadows began to close in on them from all sides. When the lights flashed back on, the assembly hall was empty. On the floor, 3 pairs of shoes lay. But on the walls, there was one message, scratched into the surface with a sharp object. "The last bell is not the end."